Corey Ellis, Albany Common Council President for the City of Albany. I will be interviewing Jeanette Gottlieb about her experience in the 1960s during the sit-ins.
I'm Jeanette Grayson Gottlieb. I grew up in Western North Carolina and went to school in Greensboro in the 60s. And I was there during the Woolworth and the Kresge sit-ins.
Tell me a little bit about your family, your parents growing up.
Okay. My mother was from Virginia. My father was from Western North Carolina, a small town called Spindale, where my grandfather and a lot of the family had settled. And both of my parents were World War II veterans. My mother was an Army nurse. She gave up her commission to marry my father, who was only a tech sergeant. And lieutenants and sergeants weren't supposed to fraternize back then. I grew up in a small town that was segregated, but my parents insisted that everybody be respected. And the only time in my life I got my mouth washed out with soap was when I came home and repeated something that I had heard. And it was the ugly word for Negro. And
Do you know what age?
Huh?
Do you know what age you were when you heard that? When you repeated that?
I was old enough to know better. Probably 5 or 6.
Wow. You have any brothers and sisters? Tell me about
I have a
yourself.
brother and a sister. They're both younger. I was the oldest in the family.
So, both your parents were, veterans. How was that growing up in that type of household?
It was one of those things you don't think about. My mother, I would say my mother was the drill sergeant, not my father. But no, we had a family close by. We had woods. We played outside. We spent a lot of time outside. We were just talking the other day about how we've become so used to air conditioning, and we grew up without air conditioning. Went barefooted all summer. And my mother was a nurse, so she didn't go back to work until I was in high school. My sister's 9 years younger than I am, so. It was just growing up. The only thing was they insisted that we treat everybody equally and be respectful. So there was a time when my mother had a black woman who came to help her, but when her husband got sick, my mother was right there at their home to help nurse.
So would you say your parents, because they raised you to treat everybody equal, would you say that had a major influence on you early on in your life?
I would say it had a significant influence.
Now tell me about your education, your college years, or high school from college years.
Well, we had 3 high schools in the county. I went to the larger one, and one of the things when you're in a semi-rural area, a lot of the people who come to the school are coming from very different economic backgrounds, and we were definitely not, I guess you would have to call us middle class, but when a lot of the people came in on buses, and I realized how fortunate I was. I had to walk because I lived just under a mile from the high school, and you couldn't ride the bus unless you lived over a mile from the high school. So I walked to school. But there were people that walked an hour to catch a bus to come down out of the mountains to go to high school. And
Was your high school segregated?
what?
Was your
High
high
school
school
was segregated. This was the late 1950s. We moved slow in that part of the country.
So,
But basically, this was a county where people worked for the mills, grew their own, everybody pretty much had their own garden because that was the way you managed to survive. And if you grew more than you could use, you either sold it or gave it away to your neighbors.
so growing up in a rural, rural high school like that, what made you want to go to college? Because I'm pretty sure a lot of kids in that area probably didn't go to college because,
I think because my father wished that he could have gone to college. It was a given that I would. And also, the other thing my parents instilled in me was a form of wanderlust. Whenever there was a cultural event, they took us to it. Back in the 50s, there were endowments that brought opera to these small towns, and ballet and all kinds of things. There would be it was like 3 or 4 performances a year, but we were there for every one of them. And the house was always full of ideas, I guess.
So tell me about the school you went to and describe, when you initially went there, what did you want to study? What school?
Well, I started out, I went to the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, which at that time was the women's college of the university. And the school was integrated, and so several of my friends were black, and I didn't realize what a hard time they had their freshman year, but by the time we were on the same hall, things were a lot better in terms of
So the atmosphere was they were in school with you, but they were still separated? Like they lived in a different hall and dorms?
well, they lived, yes, all of the first year, all of the black students were in one dorm. Sophomore year, they were spread throughout the campus. So freshman year, we all got paired up with people from communities that were similar to the communities that we came from. Didn't always make for good roommates, but it was very obvious that my 2 roommates came from towns that were exactly the same size as the one that I came from. So that was the way they set us up, but it was a little more open by second year.
So the second year in college, the dormitory, just want to be clear. So the second year in college, the dormitory, they were more integrated your second year?
They were more integrated.
Okay. So what were your goals when you in college? What did you want? When you went to college, was it just you wanted to be in college, or you had goals for yourself that you wanted to do?
I went to college to get an educated mind. I didn't go to school expecting to have a career. Most of the women, particularly from where I came from, it was assumed that if you went to college, you were going to either be a teacher, well, you were probably going to be a teacher, or you might be a nurse. And I just said, I have the opportunity to go and learn. And the teacher classes were known as nail filing, letter writing classes. And I said, I'm not wasting my time doing that. I'm going to take everything I can academically. It meant that sometimes I stretched a little. I got into a graduate level economics course, which was a real stretch, but it fit with, when I went into history and international affairs, it fit very well with what I was studying. And I got involved while I was in college. The sit-ins were going on. My father, one request of me was that I not get arrested.
So when the sit-ins began in, February 1960, your father's request was, he didn't tell you not to do it. He just told you
not to get arrested.
Huh.
So I really supported the other people at the school who went to the sit-ins. I was also involved in the National Student Association, and I ended up as president of the National Student Association. And that was a group that really worked with students on social justice issues. I got to go to the national conference twice, which meant I got to meet Stokely Carmichael and a whole bunch of other very interesting people. I met Jesse Jackson in Greensboro with the sit-ins. So I wasn't on the front line. I was the backup kind of moral support. I did go with my roommate and two of our friends who lived on the same hall with us to the local theater, which was right off campus. And we asked for 4 tickets together, and he was saying, well, you have to sit downstairs and you have to sit upstairs. And we said, well, we'll sit upstairs if you won't let them sit downstairs. And he looked at us, and he looked at us, and he looked, and he finally says, oh, hell, go ahead. And after that, people were able to go to the theater with their friends, and it didn't matter. It was just a little movie theater, but...
Yeah, but sometimes, that was part of that protest. As you said, your father said, don't get arrested, but that little incident right there changed something. So when your students, fellow students, did the school administration have a reaction or send out any letters or statements about the students getting involved in the sit-ins around campus or anything?
No, they didn't. Not that I know of. Basically, they were quietly supportive. And I'm sure there are others who have a much deeper understanding of what was going on, but there were no repercussions on campus. There were no penalties from student government. We had a very strong form of student government that regulated behavior on campus. That was back in the years of the Honor Code, and the students themselves and regulated that kind of thing on campus. And we did not get any feedback that I know of, even for people that were arrested.
I'll ask you a question. Do you think it was because you went to an all-women's college and there were no boys on campus, that it was a different type of feel when it came to civil rights activism and things of that nature?
Yes. Going to an all-women's college, I got to be part of student government. I got to be head of the National Student Association. At that time, we had very active Model United Nations. I went to the Model United Nations twice as delegations representing countries. And I can tell you that the first time I went, it was wonderful. We represented Panama, and the head of our delegation from UN, from WC, was from Panama. And we got to the Model UN, and the Carolina gentleman came up and said, "Well, we'll take care of you ladies." And she said, "Excuse me, I am the delegate from Panama. I will take care of Panama and the other delegates." And that was it. But it was the thing we ran into, and it's one of the things that I have seen in going back is that as the school became co-ed, all the offices in student government have shifted to male, and it changed the atmosphere. There's still a strong women's presence, but I had such wonderful experiences. I got to be in a small seminar with Justice Goldberg as part of when he was UN ambassador, and all of our UN, Model UN people got to sit in a seminar with him. That wouldn't happen in the co-ed school where the men would be co-opting. I think it's probably better now, but I still, when I see my alumni magazine, the president of the student body is male now. And we had very strong women leaders in the school.
Going back to the 1960 sit-ins, to what extent was there interaction between students at the Women's College and the black students at A&T?
Oh, and the black women at Bennett.
At Bennett, yeah.
Remember, the black women at Bennett were the ones who initially planned the sit-ins before the guys at A&T decided they should step forward. If you look at the videos or at the movies from then, you will see women in the UNC, well, it was the WC uniform, which were our blazers with the pocket that had a insignia on it. And they, along with other white males, would take the seats and then get up and cede their seats to their black counterparts. And you'll see them in the films if you know what you're looking at. So that was part of what they did. The other part was when people got arrested, they went down and did what they could to get them out. It was both Kresge's and World Wars where the sit-ins took place. Everybody only focuses on Woolworths, but right up all around the corner from Woolworths was Kresge's, and the sit-ins were also in Kresge's, which was a similar store to Woolworths. The feeling on campus and the feeling that we had was, go. This is about time this got done. I don't know what was in the broader community. Well, I do know, just because there were so many obnoxious people. But within that academic enclave, there was tremendous support, and all of the 5 schools in Greensboro, there are 5 colleges in Greensboro, were supportive of the sit-ins.
And you weren't afraid to get arrested?
Well, I wasn't down there on the front line.
Gotcha.
That's what I said. I did not go and sit in.
So, yeah, describe more what role, for people who don't know, for people, you have people who are sitting in, what would the role was somebody like you? What would be a role?
My role in a lot of ways was to simply say, okay, I'll take notes in class when you're sitting in. If you need help, let me know. It really wasn't sort of actively part of the sit-ins. It was just being there for the people that were doing it.
Support network. Like those who, if somebody would get arrested, those who help bail them out, that support network.
Most of us didn't have much money, but I was a work-study student, so I worked, I think 30 hours a week in the library in addition to my classes. So
I'm glad you shared that, helping out, taking notes in class. I think people lose that. Like, these were kids who were in college. They were missing classes, and I'm pretty sure professors were like, well, if you weren't down in the sit-in, so to be a person who say, okay, I'm going to agree to sit in my class and make sure you get your notes, every little bit helps.
all those are just the little pieces that people take care of other people.
So, were you involved in any other civil rights activities following your sit-ins in college?
Following the sit-ins in college.
After sit-ins in college, were you involved in any other civil rights activity?
I joined the Peace Corps.
Okay,
Went to Iran.
What were your reasons for joining the Peace Corps?
Oh. When Kennedy said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, I was right there ready to go. And I was very much influenced in my studies of some of the ugly American situations with how we were viewed abroad. And I really wanted to be part of this people-to-people opportunity where I, as an American, just an ordinary American, could go and live and interact with people in another country.
So would you say that experience, that was one of the highlight experiences when you were in Iran, was seeing how we were viewed, and how that experience helped shape you when you came back to the U.S.?
Oh, first of all, I met my husband when I was there.
Oh, okay.
He was in another group. We married when we got back. The experience in Iran has influenced our lives for the last 55 years. I just stepped down as the president of the Peace Corps Iran Association, and we just ran a national conference in Chicago. It has influenced the fact that we reach out to people in the foreign community. We reach out to other return volunteers to do projects that benefit people in the international community and in civil rights and justice situations.
So, you mentioned your husband, Steve. You met him in Iran. You ended up marrying him. You converted to Judaism. You did not convert?
No.
Okay. It said you converted to Judaism. Okay.
No, I didn't. I just have gone my own way.
Okay.
Which I find, that was another strand of my life, is that I looked at many of the major religions in the world and come down to, if you strip away all of the practices and it comes down to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You have to strip away a lot of, I don't know exactly what, window dressing to get there.
Well, yeah, it's touching people's hearts and souls rather than their mind.
But living in a Muslim country, there were restrictions, there were things that I didn't like, but there was also a level of hospitality and of caring for your neighbor and taking care of the people. And I have seen this in other parts of the world. Right now, it makes me extremely sad to see the rise of sectarianism in many parts of the world, where we're getting extremism. The Hindu nationalism just is against everything that Gandhi set out to achieve. And the ultra-religious right in this country is just, it's so wrong, because it has missed what it is that religion is all about.
And I just want to ask you a question. Dealing with you, being a Peace Corps in Iran and being a woman, over in a Muslim country. How was that experience?
It was both wonderful and it had its really bad moments. I was originally posted to a town on the shores of the Caspian Sea, and I had a really good work experience there, but unfortunately I had been placed in a house by myself, and women in Iran did not live alone. And as a foreign woman and a very young woman, there were things, I was culturally aware, but I didn't really have the guidance I felt I needed. Like when the teenagers came with a bicycle and said, let's go riding the bicycle, it was like, can a teacher go riding the bicycle? I was not one who was going to violate the norms, because my role was to be integrated into working with people there. And the worst experience I had was being spit on because I had on short sleeves. But other than that, people were welcoming. People in the bazaar would invite me in. I was invited into homes and fed, and people supported me in many, many ways while I was there. I moved after that first year into a larger city where I had a roommate, and we lived in a house. Houses were walled, and so where I lived my first year, I had 3 rooms, which was luxury, and I didn't know what to do with them. But the second year, lived in a house, and there was the main house that the family had, and then they had a smaller house on the other side of their yard that they rented out, and that's where I lived. And that was much easier because we could go to the family and say, what should I do about this? How should I act? Should I accept this invitation? And they invited us in for many things and taught us a lot more about the culture.
So now you come back to America. This is my last question, unless you want to answer. When you come back to the U.S. With this experience, the experience in Iran, how did that translate to you, to being back in the U.S.?
Well, I had culture shock when I came back. I couldn't believe the amount of waste. Everything was recycled in Iran.
Really?
And so one of the things that I came back with, and we have been part of ever since we came back, is the environmental movement. Way back when, a friend and I used to go down and go through the garbage and sort the glass in the tin in New York City and recycle them when there was a recycling project. We were involved in just about every place we've lived in the environmental movement. So that was one. The other thing that happened is the first job that I got was as a communication skills instructor for the blind. And the person that hired me said, "You were in the Peace Corps, you're adaptable, you can learn how to do this. Here's what we want you to teach." And so I taught. I also, when we were in St. Louis and when we were in West Virginia, I was involved in the schools. I was involved in a program in St. Louis of cultural enrichment in the inner city schools. And I taught about Iran. I taught these students about, and these were all black schools, or mainly all black schools because they were in the inner city. We had a good time learning about Iran. We made passports and we mapped journeys so that we flew around the world. And the older students that I worked with, I taught them about rugs, and we made miniature Iranian rugs in card boxes. And I'm hoping that it was some kind of inspiration to some of these students.
So you shared your Iranian experience. Did you share, last question, did you share your sit-in experience with any of these students? Your experience in going through that?
Not as much. However, we sat in front of St. Patrick's Cathedral with our candles to oppose the war in Vietnam. So we didn't cease to.
Oh, with the students?
No, this was when we came back.
Oh, okay. Okay.
As adults. This was after Iran.
Okay. Would you like to add anything else that we might have missed?
I don't really know what I would add, except that our lives, we don't know how many people we touch or where we've touched. We went back for my 50th college reunion, and it was interesting to make contact, and the people that I was closest to were those that we worked on civil rights issues with while I was in college. And so one of the things we have to remember is that everything we do sends out ripples. And they come back.
And I think, one thing I'll say, I think you're being very modest on your role, because that's what people do who are who are supporters. And I can tell that during your interview, you were supportive of the civil rights movement when you said, "Well, I was in the back." Those in the back help push those in the front. So there's no need to be modest about that experience. You were part of that movement.
Well, there was a piece of me that wished I could have gone on the Freedom Rides and a few of those others, but there's always the respect that you have for your parents. And I did have an uncle and a cousin who had been to college, but in my family, I was the first of my immediate family to have the opportunity to go to college, and it was so important to my parents that I succeed.
So those words of your father saying, "Just don't get arrested,"
Yeah.
it rang loud and clear in certain movements that you did.
Yes, they did.
You have to respect that. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Corey Ellis, Albany Common Council President for the City of Albany, and also Chairman of the Board of Directors for Albany Black Chamber of Commerce Foundation. I will be interviewing Steve Gottlieb around the Civil Rights Movement.
My name is Steve Gottlieb. I taught at Albany Law School for close to 40 years, as well as several other law schools as a visitor or an adjunct, various positions like that. So that was most of what I did. But I was also a practicing lawyer, ran a clinic for a while, and so forth. So that was the bulk of my career. I come from Brooklyn, New York, and you know, my introduction to what my generation called brotherhood. I know because of the gender thing, it's become hard to talk about brotherhood. Kind of have to say brotherhood and sisterhood. But that was the term that we used with respect to all sorts of intergroup relationship, black, white, different religions, and so forth. And that comes right out of my experience as a toddler. It comes out of knowing about the Holocaust going on in Germany. We're a Jewish family. It wasn't just Germany, it was any part of Europe that the Nazis controlled. And so brotherhood was a life and death principle. And this is a little different in the shall we say the levity involved,
So Steve, tell me.
but it was, you know, I was also a dyed-in-the-wool Dodger fan, and my heroes were black.
So Steve, tell me about your family, your parents, your upbringing. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Okay. It was a Jewish family. My dad was born in this country. His first language was Yiddish. Later in his life, I laughed at him because he would tell people he didn't speak Yiddish anymore, but that was not true. He could when other people did. But he prevented me, my parents deliberately prevented me from learning the language. They wanted me to grow up to be an American.
So they didn't want you to speak Yiddish.
Yeah, I knew how to say play with me. That was it. And my mother was an immigrant. She, when she was 8 years old, her mother had died, and some of her siblings were already in this country, and her father sent her in together with her, quote, older brother. She was 8 and he was 12. And they came over on a ship. She told me that she arrived in this country in 1905. And so she also grew up speaking Yiddish. Both of them learned English in school. Papa was never so proud of anything as an English paper he turned in and got an A on. My mother was remembered, that both my parents have passed away, but my mother was remembered by some in the family as a businesswoman, in that I think she was like an office manager or something of that sort. My dad was a musician in line with the kind of gender and family roles that people took in those days. My two aunts, my father's sisters, got jobs and put him through post-secondary education. So he went to the Juilliard School of Music. And spent much of his career as a music teacher. He was a pianist, he led a chorus. And so that's the background of the two of them.
Did you have any brothers and sisters? Any siblings?
The answer is both yes and no. Because they had a little girl, my sister, in 1924, after they'd been married for a couple of years. She died at the age of 3 from an ear infection which like all kids get, I got, but the difference was there were no antibiotics when Naomi was ill. And so she died as a little girl, tore my parents up. You know, when people talk about losing children on the, you know, in one context or another, I remember because I didn't know them when Naomi was alive, but I knew the impact that it had on them. And it does not go away. People talk about closure. There's no point when that is painful.
I want to go back to, you know, obviously what you said, your father wanted you to assimilate. You know, he wanted the assimilation process to happen fast. That's why he didn't want you to speak Yiddish. Tell me about that, the community. Was the community you were raised in, was that sort of the same, were they, if you remember the community, your outside community you were raised in, was that sort of the same message you were getting, or was that just coming from your father to assimilate?
None of the kids talked the language of the old country.
Gotcha.
None of them. Now, it's not necessarily that we talked about our parents' wishes. I lived in a community that was largely partly Jewish and partly Italian. And I think it seems to me a lot of the high school were those two groups, although one of my friends and our class valedictorian was neither. He was a Protestant who happened to go to the church that was right on catty corner from where we lived most of those years. And Timmy went on to be a physicist and teach in the CUNY system in New York. But so.
Yeah, you were telling me about your, you were telling me earlier that your civil rights activism began in high school. Tell me more about that.
There were two incidents and I can't tell you which one was first.
No problem.
It's a blur in my head. But the result of one of them, which was a contest, was that I delivered a talk about what brotherhood means to me on CBS radio. It was on a program called the Tex and Jink Show, which I know you don't remember. I don't know if Paul does. But it was fairly obvious, by the way, that there was a piece of affirmative action going on. In the judges for that, it was a citywide contest. One of the judges was Walter Cronkite, the newsman. One of the judges was Frank Hogan, who was the district attorney for New York County. And the third judge was Hewlin Jack, who was the borough president of Manhattan. I had a lot of respect, by the way, for Hewlin Jack, which was not altered when Frank Hogan, a couple of years later, put Jack in prison for accepting a gift. And it was a relatively small gift. It wasn't going to influence Hewlin Jack to do anything. But that happened. That was the panel. And they chose as the winner of this contest, a Catholic girl from a Catholic school. And it was very obvious that they were looking for a Jew for second, because they had this spot on Tex and Jinx on CBS, but it was a Friday night. So they tried to award second place, or did award second place, to a Jewish fellow who was unwilling to appear on that program because it was Friday night. I was brought up Reform. It didn't matter to me whether I went on Friday. So I got to be the honorary third place winner, and I went on Texas. That was my first appearance on radio. And as you know, one of the things that I do now is I'm fairly regularly, every week, I have a spot on WAMC. The other thing that I look back on that's significant to me was that I chaired a process which resulted in my having the responsibility of bringing Jesse Owens to my high school, where he accepted our Brotherhood Award that my student group gave him, and I gave it to him on their behalf. And he gave a talk, which I know was broadcast not just to the assembly that we were in, but it was broadcast to the entire school. And I had the pleasure of accepting my fellow students' congratulations for days after that because of how good Jesse Owens' talk was.
Was your high school segregated?
Depends what you mean by segregated. I mean, there weren't a lot of blacks living in the district that was assigned to Midwood High School. That's not to say that there weren't any blacks who attended. I knew a fellow whose middle name was Washington. I can't remember if he was George Washington something else, but he was clearly black, and you know, we had a cordial relationship. And at my 50th reunion, a black woman told me, or several of us, that she took 3 forms of transportation to get to Midwood and had faked her residence so she could go to Midwood because she knew that she would be challenged at Midwood High as opposed to whatever school she had been assigned with. Now, as a lawyer, I would say yes, Midwood was segregated, whether it was by the Supreme Court's definition of doing it on purpose. I wasn't part of that, and I don't know records about that, but certainly the lines were drawn in that way. Bedford-Stuyvesant was the nearest large black area to us, and was not part of Midwood. On the other hand, there were high schools that were closer. So if you were designing the neighborhoods, the high school by its neighborhood, Midwood was built in a white neighborhood.
Yep. Mostly, and redlining was going on way back then, so that would, you know.
Oh, absolutely.
So that leads to segregation, which we don't, you know. So, college. Tell me about your college years, where you went to school.
I went to Princeton. Princeton had its own civil rights development, and I'm in the middle of that.
Tell me more about
In
that.
the sense that about 10 years, I would never have thought of applying to Princeton because it had a reputation of anti-Semitism, of not accepting Jews. But after World War II, I think this is probably a lot of places, but I know it was done at Princeton because it's been talked about. Princeton made the decision to take off the limitation on the number of Jews in the class. And so that number ballooned fairly quickly.
Sounds like that was affirmative action. A form of affirmative action.
Well, you know, affirmative action has many meanings, and yes, and I've done affirmative action as an administrator, by the way. But by some definitions, it was certainly a deliberate decision. And when I went to campus for my interview with one of the admissions deans, I don't remember his name, I was expecting to have to prove that I was good enough for Princeton. And he obviously was trying to convince me to come. I walked out of that and said to I think my dad had brought me down, and said to him, I want to go. They convinced me to come, and I had largely a very good experience. It was wonderful with the faculty. There was some anti-Semitism among the students. I think some of the students that were anti-Semitic in 1958 to 62 when I graduated wouldn't admit to it now. I think they've grown up. But yeah, it was, and I learned a lot about race when I was there. Not as much as at law school, because I went to Yale Law. I used to joke that my political career was over after an Ivy League education like Princeton and Yale. I had no chance, was my joke. And probably good for me. I wouldn't have been a very good politician. But Yale was very famous for international law at that time. And so there were people there from all over the country, all over the world. Not country, the world. I had friends from India, Pakistan, Latin America, Africa. I mean, and I was in class with them. So, and that to me was kind of like my wife was describing, is fascinating to me. They came from very different worlds. Some of them settled in this country and done very, very well. One of the people that I'm remembering was not in the international curriculum, but in a sense was, part of that broadening of my knowledge of people, because that was Judge Jose Cabranes, who was a classmate of mine, and we were good friends, and we've been in their house, and he's from Puerto Rico.
So you said Yale, you mostly got that. Let's go back to Princeton.
Okay. I do that regularly.
Late 50s, early 60s, a lot of things are going on in this country.
Oh, I didn't mention.
Okay.
Maybe this is where you were going.
Well, maybe you gotta help me get there when I ask you. Late 50s, early 60s, on campus in Princeton. What was going on? We know what was going on in the country. Civil rights movements happening, mainly in the South.
Okay. In the administration,
But what was going on in Princeton during this time?
let me start with the administration.
Perfect.
Because they were doing something that we didn't know about. But while I was there, they were laying plans for the admission, the broader admission of both blacks and women. There were 0 women when I was there. One black man did very well, has had a terrific career, but he's the only black graduate of Princeton. But Princeton was making plans to change that big time. They were making plans to bring in a black dean, to do very significant recruitment in the black community. My class didn't see the benefit of that, except to the extent that, we've cheered Robert on in his career. And it was also laying plans. I mean, the admission for women wasn't, like that. It was planned, it was tested out with the alumni. They were laying the groundwork, and then that happened 7 years after I graduated. I graduated in '62, and the 60s were a period when Princeton made changes, but there were changes that were being planned under President Goheen, who was the president in my time. On campus, I discovered, I don't know where the recruiting was. I wasn't getting the recruiting. I discovered that some of my classmates had gone, I don't really know who, but I know that there were classmates who went down on the Freedom Rides. I had tremendous respect for them. I wasn't the kind of person who would have taken a chance with his own skull, to be honest with you. And I've always felt a little embarrassed about that. I didn't get arrested. She was trying not to get arrested because of her father.
Yeah.
I didn't get arrested, and I feel embarrassed about that. My part in the civil rights movement, after what I told you about high school,
Yes.
tended to be as a lawyer. And as I described it, the safety of law offices. The first thing I did after law school was to walk down to the offices of the NAACP legal staff, which in those days was run by Robert Carter, who became Judge Carter. It was never Thurgood Marshall's office. That was a different office, and I'm not sure exactly physically where that was located.
Yeah.
But Carter was actually abroad in those months. So I have met him and talked with him, but that was mostly later. Barbara Morris was the black woman lawyer who was running the office and really designed my career for me. She told me what she thought I needed to do to kind of get the training that I needed and then go on to do the kind of work that I did. So I did what she did. So what she said. I went to work for the largest corporate law firm that would hire me, took the training that they offered, and then went to work for the Legal Aid Society. I actually moved to St. Louis to do that, where everybody thought I knew how to do anything because I'd worked for a corporate firm.
Yes.
Which was an absolute nonsense, and I was trying not to say anything. And then I went from there into teaching. Initially not here. I first did some teaching in St. Louis and then at West Virginia, and then I spent most of 40 years here. But race relations were always part of that. I taught that issue. I taught about it both in the general constitutional law course. I taught a course on civil rights.
Yeah.
And the legal aid work and the clinic work, you know, most of my clients were black. My proudest work as a lawyer in St. Louis was on behalf of a group called Black Survival. It was run by a woman named Freddie Mae Brown. And what that group, with my help, did was basically prevent the powers that be from splitting the black community in two with a highway. And that was also an education to me because I got to interview every expert in town about why that would be a disaster for the black community.
So you go to NAACP, I just want to back up, and
Sure.
and she tells you, how you can best help this cause or further this cause down the road. She wasn't thinking just today.
That's right.
She was thinking down the road was to make sure you gained all the knowledge you could, the experience, and then come back. And that's what led you to move forward in your legal profession.
Come in, not specifically to her office,
Yeah, but
to the work,
to the work.
to the job.
So how did you end up in the Peace Corps or Iran, I think?
Okay, and I had already agreed to join the Peace Corps when I went into the NAACP office. I had already had a teach-in by one of my teachers about the war in Vietnam. Jeanette described our taking candles to St. Patrick's Cathedral. It's a little lesson in brotherhood right there, by the way, because the taxi driver immediately understood that these 4 former Peace Corps volunteers carrying candles were going to a peace demonstration, and he was livid. I turned the conversation to the Mets. That was 1969. The Mets were losing last place and were on their way to winning the World Series. And Mayor Lindsay was campaigning for re-election from the dugout. And by the time we left the cab, he couldn't believe how such nice Mets fans could be opposed to the war in Vietnam. But anyway, but yeah, I was strongly opposed to the war in Vietnam. I didn't want to kill anybody over there, and I didn't want to be killed over there. partly was proud and partly was feeling very guilty because I knew some people who lost their lives over there. And I think locally, Terry Kinlan was in the war in Vietnam, was very badly injured. If you've seen, he's got a little metal plate in his head. And was very much affected by the experience of being rescued by black soldiers.
Mm.
But anyway, I was initially signed up to go to Latin America because I spoke some Spanish, which I mostly lost. And I thought, oh, what a great experience. And then they sent around this letter offering a position for people with graduate degrees to go to Iran and teach an American style university that they were setting up there. And I called up and I said, first of all, do you consider law a graduate degree? In those days, the law degree wasn't a JD, it was an LLB, which is a bachelor's. But that's the old English style of the degree. It was a 3-year degree. They said yes. And then I asked them, well, what's the impact on being Jewish over there? And he said, the Shah's a friend of the Jews, there's no problem.
No.
And indeed, there was an embassy there. Everybody else is telling me it wasn't an embassy, it was a lower level of thing. But I was in what I thought was the embassy because I did fly directly from Tehran to Tel Aviv. And then, continue. That's when I went home. And then I went to Italy and Austria and Britain.
So your experience in a Peace Corps, how did that, now coming back, once you came back to the U.S., how did that shape you and influence you with your profession and you personally?
Well, first of all, people were very nice to me over there, which is not to say that nobody had ridiculous ideas about Jews. I had one woman who was the daughter of friends ask me where my horns were. She didn't dislike me. She wasn't afraid of me. But she had imbibed that trope, which is nonsense. But by and large, I was well treated by people over there. I don't know how many knew I was Jewish. I didn't necessarily talk a lot about it. I did go for the high holy days. I found the temple and went there, which was an interesting experience. And I was in mosques over there. Some of it I was there as a tourist, but somebody at the university died, and my host who taught at the university, I lived with a family, and I lived in their house, unlike the situation of my wife. And he took me to the funeral. I came back, I wasn't afraid of Islam. I wasn't afraid of Muslims, whether they're black or white. I've been in some of the mosques here in Albany. There's one right down the street from WAMC and on Central Avenue. I've spoken there. I did a very small part in trying to help. Terry Kinlan was the lawyer and his office was the lawyer, but I tried to help in a very small way with respect to the defense of Aref and Muhammad. And I knew him because he'd been in the law school on a number of occasions at different events. So, it just broke down those barriers for me.
So I think when I'm listening to your story, I think...
It's not a story, it's all true.
Your life story.
Okay.
So would you say that the adapting that word brotherhood, because you spoke about that earlier, the brotherhood. Once you adapted that form of in your being, not just in your mind, but in your being, do you believe that's led you to? It was just not easier, but it was just I can represent this person because I see them as a brotherhood, or I fit in this group because it's a brotherhood.
Oh yeah, I mean it's that's the way I think of the world. Absolutely, that's been my career. Even though I've been doing a number of different things, I've always found ways of trying to deal with the intergroup aspects, and mostly that's been black-white.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, it's been black-white in this country.
Yes.
But not exclusively. Because, we have, when 9/11 happened, I was getting in touch with my Muslim friends all over the country to ask them how they were, because I was afraid for them.
So you were looking at, once you saw 9/11, you were thinking back about civil rights that could be violated because they were just Muslim.
Oh yeah, and I was a member of the New York Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And we ran a set of hearings in New York City on what was happening in the wake of 9/11.
How did you get appointed to that? Like, was that an appointment? How did that come about? Do you remember? 'Cause that's a big deal.
Okay. I was on the board, there's a little guesswork here, but I was on the board of the New York Civil Liberties Union.
Okay.
And that was because I was active here. And I went down to some of the statewide meetings and I said to the president that I was very interested in being part of the fundraising. I bowled him over.
Yes.
Somebody is saying, I'm interested in the fundraising. Fundraising is actually fun. You talk to people who care about what you're doing and want to help. I enjoyed the fundraising work that I did. But as soon as I said that, he wanted me on the board. And I was on the board, I think for a dozen years, and then we adopted a time limit, and I was time limited. But it's in that period of years that I was appointed to the advisory committee. And I can't tell you who said what to whom.
Okay. To the work.
Steve, I'd like to go back before we get too much further, because I know you participated in the March on Washington,
I did.
and
Yes, I
you have passed over that day. Could you share with us your memories of that?
Oh, sure. I think I said to Corey that I was living quite near the White House, which means I was very near everything. And the story for, those who came by bus probably came later. But I understood that the morning was at the Washington Monument. Now, understand, my dad was a classical musician. I was listening to classical music when I was still in mother's womb, right? So I go to the Washington Monument, people are singing, and by the way, he programmed what we used to call spirituals as part of the concerts that he gave. And I had heard some of the greats. I got to shake Marian Anderson's hand after a concert, and that's a memory I will not forget. Not significant to her, but it sure meant a lot to this teenager to meet Marian Anderson. And William Warfield the next year. He was the guy who sang Old Man River in the movie of Chopin. So But she was on the podium, and she would sing the national anthem a little later, Marian Anderson. The people who were singing when we were at the Washington Monument were folk singers. I'd never heard of them. I went around looking to find out who they were. I liked the singing, I just wasn't familiar. And nobody could tell me who was singing. I recognized, the next time I heard Odetta's voice, I knew who I'd heard, or at least I knew I'd heard her. And, oh wow. But I was listening with the ears of a classically trained musician, and she had a voice that any musician would just die for. She had a fantastic voice, as did Marian Anderson. But anyway, we're at the Washington Monument in the morning and basically listening to music, and I'm trying to figure out who it was that was singing. I knew nobody who was there, because I didn't walk over with anybody, and people were from wherever. I was an audience. And then there's the moment when we start locking arms. And again, I'm locking arms with people. I locked arms with some black fellow. I don't know his name. Because we were singing from the moment we locked arms. We weren't introducing ourselves to each other. We were just singing and walking to the Lincoln Memorial along, obviously along Pennsylvania Avenue. I think I started to say to you that there was a woman, and I'm blanking on her last name, but Paul, you introduced me to her over the phone. We've talked. Mickey Kahn. And we must have been within 20 feet, but I found that out later because she was at the information booth, and we, in the march, kind of did a left turn right at the information booth. I didn't know her then, but then we kind of went to where we wanted to watch the thing from. Now, it's funny, in this heat now, people are talking about heat prostration. I had a sense of my limits. I was not heading for, it was a bright sunny day. I was not heading for any place where the sun could reach me. I found a place under the trees where I could be for most of it. And by the way, I'd heard King before at college. College had a system, Princeton had a system where you had to go to a certain number of services, but you could go to anybody's services. And I went to the main chapel when there was a speaker that I admired and wanted to be at, and King was one of those. But in certain ways, I knew about the other people who were there, who were really part of the labor movement. That was a march for jobs and freedom. And it was really originally put together by the labor movement, and I knew about those guys. Even more than I knew about Martin Luther King, except that he was an eloquent speaker. I didn't know a lot about his part of the movement, except to the extent it was on television. Or that my friends had been part of the freedom rides and so forth. Friends, fellow students. But by the time, they put King on late, and I was getting very hot, even under the trees. So I was moving. It was actually closer to the front where King was going to speak, but it was also closer to the exit. And I was getting myself close so I could hear King speak and then get out of there and cool off. And to me, it's very funny that what I'm doing when King is speaking is trying to protect myself from heat, whatever.
Yeah.
But that's what was going on. But I do remember his speech. I couldn't have repeated it to you. But I was there for every word and participated in the applause.
So, so you go to the March on Washington by yourself,
Yes.
and you mentioned to me about if you were on a bus. Why did you have that feeling about?
Well, because they recruited people to go down together. The bus was to go from Albany to Washington. That's a 7-hour bus trip. I don't know exactly how the recruiting was done. I presume some of it was done out of the black churches here. So some of the people on the buses knew each other when they got on the bus, and others were sitting together and had plenty of time to chat on the way down. So yeah, that's what it, would have meant that I didn't get to participate on. Most of my clients, many of my bosses were black. So I've had plenty of, maybe not enough, but plenty of contact with the black community since then. But at that moment, it wasn't that I'd never met a black person, but it wasn't something I'd had a lot of. This is just before, this is 1963. Okay, that's the summer between my first and second year of law school. That's what it was. So law school was already changing that, but it would change it even more when I got to take electives the next 2 years. I did have blacks in my class.
This is at Yale.
This is at Yale.
So after you go to this march, you're in this. I'm pretty sure at that time you could feel the energy, even though it was hot.
Oh yeah.
So how do you think that furthered for you as a person going forward after that experience on that day?
What King said was already so right to me. To me, he's preaching to the choir. We often talk about that, when I get on the radio. Am I preaching to the choir or am I converting anybody? And most of the time, I think I'm probably preaching to the choir. And even though I'm obviously not black, but I was committed philosophically. I hadn't done all the work that I would do later, but philosophically I was there. And so I was basically cheering them on. By the way, some of my friends here heard the prior version of I Have a Dream in Detroit. I'm sorry?
I was there in Detroit.
And some of my Peace Corps buddies were there in Detroit.
It's I guess it's not a question, but it's a thought that I had when your father, because things stem from childhood, and when you said your father pushed you to assimilate, my generation would think from your generation when you were a kid that your assimilation wouldn't be to look at brotherhood. Your assimilation would be what was going on in those times, the segregation part. So it's very touching to see that even though your father wanted you to assimilate to the culture of America.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Because the culture was...
And I remember
so
when
culture-
Brown came down, and I remember the maps of which schools integrated on their own and which schools had to be pushed. And of course that took 20 years or more. It's still going on. And now it's, people keep saying, how long is this going to last? Well, it's been, 75 years since Brown? And a lot more since the beginning. I mean, the Civil Rights Movement really has no beginning. It's forever. Can I tell you a little story?
Sure.
My dad led a girls' chorus, and in high school. And when they would finish their performance, they would meet in a room, take their black robes off, obviously they're dressed underneath, and I know this would not happen anymore like this, but the girls would line up to kiss my dad, all of them. And because it was very poignant in my memory, I'll never forget. There was a black girl in that chorus, and she was in that line, and some way she communicated to my father, she saw several people back, that she didn't know if it was appropriate to come up and kiss him. And he let her know that it was fine, and she did. Now, you know, in this age, there are lots of meanings that one can ascribe to that. But at the time, it was a way of saying, I don't treat you any different than I treat any of the other girls. I think that's what it meant to my dad. That's what it meant to me.